Iran is losing $500 million a day, its oil is trapped, markets are frozen, and its leadership is fracturing. When Washington offered a ceasefire, Tehran read it as a reprieve. They were wrong. It was a tactical pause for the Pentagon to calibrate the noose. While the regime used the lull to stage theater in the Strait, a clumsy attempt to project relevance, Washington simply finalized the blockade. This was not an act of defiance. It was a reaction from a regime that has run out of moves. Tehran didn't just misread the ceasefire, they used it to confirm their own strategic isolation. The Gulf is not spinning out of control, it is being systematically closed. Immediately after Washington extended the ceasefire to keep diplomacy alive, Iran announced that it had seized 2 container ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Almost at the same time, British maritime reporting indicated that at least 2 other ships had come under attack, while Iranian media claimed a 3rd vessel had also been targeted. One of the incidents was serious enough to leave a ship's bridge heavily damaged. The crews were reported safe, but the message was unmistakable. Tehran wanted the world to see one thing and one thing only: Iran could still stop ships' fire in the Strait and turn Hormuz back into a theater of fear. From a distance, that can look like calculated retaliation. That is exactly how Tehran wants it framed. 2 commercial vessels were intercepted, armed Iranian boats closing in. State media are moving quickly to package the scene as enforcement, not desperation. Images spread, headlines follow, and for a few hours, the regime gets what it needs most: the appearance of motion, the appearance of control, the appearance that it can still command the emotional tempo around one of the most important energy corridors on Earth. But context changes everything. A government losing roughly $500 million a day, watching oil revenue stall, struggling to keep markets frozen, and facing visible internal strain is not acting from confidence when it does this. It is acting from compression. And compressed regimes do not usually make elegant strategic choices. They make loud ones. That is why timing matters so much. Washington had just extended the ceasefire. Pakistan had been trying to buy time for another round of talks. Iran itself was under pressure to produce a more unified position. If Tehran were operating from discipline, this was the moment to slow down, regroup, and decide what could still be salvaged. Instead, it reached for spectacle. That is not the behavior of a government using a pause to negotiate from strength. It is the behavior of a system too fractured, too angry, or too desperate to sit still. And the ships themselves exposed the weakness of the move. These were not tankers suddenly reopening Iran's trapped oil exports. They were not military assets that shifted the balance at sea. They were commercial vessels carrying the mixed cargo of ordinary trade. Seizing them does not reopen a single oil lane for Tehran. It does not pay police salaries. It does not stabilize a shuttered stock market. It does not move one additional barrel of crude to a waiting buyer. In strategic terms, the seizure adds almost nothing to Iran's position. What it does add is justification. It hands Washington a cleaner argument that Iran is escalating even during a ceasefire, and it gives the United States more room to tighten pressure. It was already building. That is why the damaged vessel matters so much. A ship left crippled, stranded, or drifting is not a symbol of command. It is evidence of degraded capacity. Real control means you can intercept, secure process, and exploit what you take. It means the operation ends with the target where you want it under conditions you control for an outcome you can use. But when even a relatively simple interdiction starts producing damaged ships and messy end states, the image changes. What looked like power starts looking like improvisation by a regime using tools that still exist physically, but no longer fit the strategic reality around them. This may be Tehran's deeper mistake. It tried to use the ceasefire as a stage for relevance, while Washington used the same pause for preparation. That imbalance matters. The United States did not need Iranian ship seizures to know the blockade was working, but those seizures made the political case for continued enforcement easier. They reinforced the impression that Tehran was not stabilizing. It was lashing out. And every time a pressured regime lashes out without changing the underlying balance, it teaches its adversary something useful: where the nerves are, where the weak spots are, and how much pain is now being felt behind the rhetoric. So the seizure of ships in Hormuz should not be read as proof that Iran still controls the board. It should be read as something much less flattering and much more dangerous. It is the move of a player who knows the board is closing and is trying to create shock before the walls move in any further. That can still do damage, it can still create headlines, it can still frighten markets. But it does not change the core reality. A regime bleeding, money-losing room, and struggling to speak with one voice is not projecting strength when it grabs passing ships. It is revealing that the old tools are all it has left. When most people hear the word ceasefire, they imagine both sides stepping back. They imagine silence, delay, a pause in violence while diplomats try to salvage what still can be salvaged. That is not what this ceasefire was. Not in practice. Not in the waters around Iran. Washington did not treat the pause as a break from pressure. It treated the pause as an opportunity to sharpen pressure. While Tehran was busy grabbing ships and staging images for domestic and regional audiences, the Pentagon was doing something colder and far more consequential. It was rearming, repositioning, and preparing for the next phase if talks failed. That is what made Iran's move so reckless. Ceasefire should have been the moment to sit still, reduce the temperature, and avoid giving Washington a cleaner political case for renewed force. Instead, Iran used the pause to create exactly the kind of incident that justifies harder action later. That matters because the American side was never pretending otherwise. Trump made clear that the conflict was not over, only delayed. He refused to give a timeline, he refused to signal impatience. And in conflicts like this, the side that controls the tempo controls far more than the next strike package. It controls the psychology of everyone waiting for the next decision. The most revealing part is that Washington did not even hide what it was doing. CENTCOM pushed out its own message about rearming, retooling, and adjusting tactics during the ceasefire. That was not routine military language. It was signaling. It was the United States saying plainly and publicly that the pause would not be wasted. Iran was supposed to see it. China was supposed to see it. Every insurership operator in regional government was supposed to see it. The message was simple. The blockade was not relaxing. The machine behind it was being tightened. And while the headlines stayed fixed on seized vessels, the systems that actually decide the next round were staying awake. Maritime patrol aircraft, persistent surveillance, long-range intelligence platforms, real-time targeting networks. Ceasefire did not shut those down. It gave them more time to map, track, refine, and prepare. That is why this pause was never neutral. Neutral pauses help both sides equally. This one did not. It favored the side with the larger logistics base, the deeper surveillance architecture, and the stronger ability to turn a temporary lull into an operational advantage. That asymmetry is the heart of the story. Iran appears to have read ceasefire as breathing room. Washington read it as preparation space. Iran used it to stage relevance. Washington used it to lock readiness into place. One side spent the pause proving that it could still make noise. The other spent the pause making sure that if the noise continued, the response would arrive faster, cleaner, and harder than before. That is not a small difference. It is the difference between acting and preparing the terms under which all later action will be judged. And this is why the ship seizures may end up mattering less as standalone events than as timing errors. They happened at the worst possible moment for Tehran. Not when Washington was exhausted, not when the blockade was loosening, but when American forces were reloading under the political cover of diplomacy. That is the strategic trap. Iran thought the pause softened the board. In reality, it hardened it. Ceasefire was not a gift to Tehran. It was a window for Washington to make the next move from a stronger position. And the more Iran mistakes that window for weakness, the more likely it is to walk into the blow that window was designed to prepare. From the outside, the visible story is ships in the Strait of Hormuz, gunfire, seizures, ceasefire extensions, threats from Washington, defiance from Tehran. But the real battle is not only happening on the water, it is happening inside the financial bloodstream of the regime itself. That is where this blockade is doing the kind of damage bombs often cannot do cleanly. Bombs destroy infrastructure. A financial chokehold does something slower, and in some ways more dangerous. It forces every faction inside a stressed system to start asking the same question at the same time. Who still gets paid, who still gets protected, and who gets sacrificed first when the money stops moving. That is why the number matters so much. $500 million a day is not just a headline. It is not an abstraction. It is the approximate scale of daily loss that starts turning ideology into arithmetic. Regimes like this do not live on slogans alone. They live on patronage, on salaries, on smuggling channels, on procurement, on side payments, on the quiet flow of benefits that keeps armed men loyal and competing factions temporarily aligned. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not simply a military formation. It is a power network sitting across ports, energy construction, logistics, and coercion. When the oil money slows, the damage does not remain economic for long. It becomes political, then institutional, then personal. That is why cutting revenue matters more than sinking a few more ships. A ship can be replaced, hidden, or mythologized. A salary missed on time does something much harder to contain. It spreads through barracks, ministries, police units, contractors, and families. It changes how loyalty is calculated. It changes what hardliners can promise their own people. It changes which faction blames which other faction for weakness. That is how strong-looking regimes begin to decay from within. Not in one cinematic collapse, in suspicion, in delay, in unpaid obligations, in the quiet realization that the center can still bark orders but may no longer be able to finance obedience at the same scale as before. The stock market story matters for the same reason. A market can be kept closed for a while to stop panic from becoming visible. But closure is not stability. Closure is suspended recognition. It is the state saying, in effect, we know the price is there, but we are not ready to let anyone see it yet. That buys time, not confidence. And when time runs out, the pressure comes back with more force than before. Investors who have been trapped do not reopen with trust. They reopen with exit in mind. That is what makes prolonged closure so revealing. It is not proof of control. It is proof that the regime fears the information that a functioning market would immediately produce. And all of this feeds back into the ship seizures. From Tehran's point of view, grabbing vessels in Hormuz still creates images of action control and defiance. But inside the regime, those images have to compete with far more brutal facts. Ships seized do not reopen oil exports. Cargoes harassed do not stabilize the currency. Gunfire in the Strait does not restart salaries. A dramatic act at sea can be distracting for a day. It cannot repair a system whose core bargain has always depended on distributing money downward while concentrating power upward. When that bargain starts failing, coercion has to work harder just to create the appearance of continuity. This is why the comparison to a mafia structure, while blunt, carries some strategic truth. Systems built on fear alone are unstable. Systems built on fear plus money can last much longer. But once the money starts drying up, fear has to do all the work by itself, and fear is a far more expensive instrument than it looks. It requires more punishment, more surveillance, more visible force, and more internal discipline at exactly the moment all of those things are getting harder to sustain. That is when pressure stops feeling external and starts becoming internalized. The regime is no longer only fighting the blockade, it is fighting the consequences of the blockade inside its own chain of command. And that is the real danger for Tehran now. Not simply that it is under pressure from the outside, but that outside pressure is beginning to reorganize the inside. Once money stops flowing, every unresolved fracture gets sharper. Every dormant rivalry wakes up. Every public gesture of defiance has to work twice as hard to conceal a private loss of control. That is why ship seizures are not the real story, they are symptoms. The deeper story is that the regime's old survival formula, oil out, cash in loyalty, managed fear maintained, is no longer working cleanly. And when a system built on oil and coercion starts losing both at once, regret does not arrive in speeches. It arrives in silence, in unpaid salaries, in frozen markets, and in men with guns beginning to wonder who still controls the future. This war is not ending in a fireball. It is ending in attrition, in oil that cannot leave, in salaries that do not arrive, in markets that stay shut because the truth would trigger panic the moment they open, in commands that still move downward but no longer carry the same certainty with them. That is how power begins to rot before it collapses. Not when the slogans stop, when the machinery behind the slogans starts failing. And once that machinery starts failing, every act of defiance becomes more expensive, more theatrical, and less useful than the last. That is where Tehran is now. It seized ships to prove it still had leverage. But leverage that cannot reopen exports, stabilize finances, or hold a frightened elite together is already curdling into something else. The Strait still exists, the fast boats still exist, the threats still exist. But the conditions that once made those tools dangerous are being peeled away one layer at a time, not shattered in one blow, stripped down. Until what remains is not strategic strength, but a regime performing control under conditions it no longer truly controls. And performance has a short shelf life when the money dries up underneath it. This is the part dictatorships never admit out loud. Regret does not arrive as confession. It arrives as symptoms in frozen exchanges, in unpaid men with rifles, in oil that stays trapped, in factions that stop trusting the center to keep feeding them. That is how a system built on fear and patronage begins to turn inward and consume itself, not all at once, quietly, bitterly, then very fast. So the real question now is not whether Tehran is under pressure, it is. The real question is which part of the regime fails first when pressure stops being external and becomes internal. The money, the chain of command, or the illusion that anyone is still fully in control. Leave your view in the comments. And follow the channel because the next phase of this story may be quieter on the surface but far more final underneath.